The morning sky turned red like blood when the arrows started falling on the village, and Lauren knew her world was ending before she even opened her eyes fully. She rolled out of bed and grabbed her leather boots while screaming filled the air. Outside her small wooden house and somewhere close by, she heard her mother crying out in pain and fear. The dragon sensed danger before Lauren did, and all three of them burst through the window in a shower of broken glass with their scales gleaming. In the firelight that was already spreading from house to house, Ember, the largest dragon with scales like burning coals, landed beside her and lowered his massive head so Lauren could climb onto his back while ash and cloud circled overhead, shrieking warnings that came too late to save anyone. Lauren's hands shook as she pulled herself up onto Ember's neck and wrapped her fingers around the thick scales that were warm to the touch like holding onto pieces of a dying star. The village elder ran past her door with an arrow in his shoulder, and behind him came the human soldiers dressed in dark armor that made them look like shadows come to life and hungry for destruction. Lauren had lived for 300 years in this peaceful village, hidden deep in the ancient forest where elves practiced the old magic and lived in harmony with nature and dragons. She had never seen a human soldier before today, but she had heard the stories from travelers who spoke of wars and burning cities, and entire elf clans wiped out because humans feared what they could not understand. Her father had always said those stories were exaggerations meant to scare children, but now as she watched her neighbors fall under the rain of arrows, she realized every word had been true. Ember launched into the sky with Lauren clinging to his neck, and below them the village became smaller and smaller, until it looked like a child's toy burning in someone's careless hands. Ash flew beside them with Cloud bringing up the rear, and together the four of them headed deeper into the forest where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. Lauren's heart pounded in her chest like a war drum and tears streamed down her face. But she couldn't look back, because if she did, she would see the smoke rising from everything she had ever known and loved. They flew for hours without stopping, and Lauren's legs went numb from gripping Ember's sides, and her throat burned from breathing the cold, high-altitude air that tasted like ice and desperation. When Ember finally landed in a small clearing beside a stream, Lauren slid off his back and collapsed onto the moss-covered ground while her whole body trembled with exhaustion and grief. The dragons formed a protective circle around her, and Ember pressed his warm snout against her shoulder, making soft rumbling sounds that were meant to comfort, but only made her cry harder. She was alone now, with no family and no home, and nothing but 3 loyal dragons who would follow her to the end of the world if she asked them to. Lauren had always been different from other elves, because she could communicate with dragons through an ancient form of magic that few still remembered how to use. Her grandmother had taught her the old songs and the secret words that made dragons listen, and over the years Lauren had formed bonds with Ember, Ash, and Cloud that went deeper than friendship. They were her family now, and she was theirs, and together they would survive or die, but at least they would not be alone. The sun began to set, and the forest grew dark and full of strange sounds that made Lauren's pointed ears twitch with nervous energy. She knew she should build a fire, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's face and heard her father's voice calling her name. Ash brought her a dead rabbit and dropped it at her feet, but Lauren couldn't eat because her stomach twisted. With nausea and grief, Cloud curled up beside her and radiated warmth like a living furnace. And eventually Lauren stopped shivering enough to think clearly about what to do next. She couldn't go back to the village because there was nothing left to go back to, and she couldn't stay here because the human soldiers would eventually find her trail and finish what they started. The only option was to keep moving deeper into the wild places where humans feared to go, and hope that somewhere out there she could find other survivors, or at least a safe place to hide. Lauren spent that first night staring up at the stars through gaps in the forest canopy and wondering why the universe allowed such terrible things to happen to innocent people. Her grandmother used to say that everything happened for a reason, and that even tragedy could lead to something beautiful if you were brave enough to keep walking forward. But right now, Lauren couldn't see anything beautiful in the ashes of her destroyed home, or hear anything hopeful in the silence where her family's voices should have been. She made a promise to herself and to the dragons that she would survive long enough to understand why this happened, and maybe long enough to make the humans who did this pay for every life they took. Revenge was not the elf way, but Lauren no longer cared about tradition or wisdom, or any of the peaceful teachings that had failed to protect her people when it mattered most. Morning came too soon and brought with it a cold rain that soaked through Lauren's clothes and made the dragons irritable and restless. They needed to move, but Lauren's legs felt like they were made of stone, and her heart felt even heavier. Ember nudged her gently with his enormous head and made a questioning sound deep in his throat. She stood up slowly and climbed back onto his neck, and together they rose into the gray sky and flew toward an uncertain future that scared her more than she wanted to admit. Below them, the forest stretched endlessly in all directions like a green ocean that could swallow her whole and never give her back. Lauren didn't know where they were going, but anywhere was better than the burning ruins of everything she used to call home. 2 days of flying and hiding and running had left Lauren weak and dizzy with hunger, because the only food she had eaten was a handful of berries that Ash found growing on a bush near a waterfall. The dragons could hunt for themselves, and they brought her small animals, but Lauren's hands shook too much to prepare the meat, and her stomach rejected everything she tried to swallow. She knew she was dying slowly from exhaustion and grief and lack of food, but some stubborn part of her refused to give up, even when giving up seemed like the easier choice. On the third morning, Lauren woke to the smell of smoke, and her first thought was that the soldiers had found her. But then she realized the smoke smelled different than burning wood. It smelled like a campfire where someone was cooking breakfast, and the scent made her mouth water. Despite her nausea, Ember growled low in his throat and positioned himself between Lauren and the source of the smoke, while Ash and Cloud took to the air to scout the area. Lauren pulled herself to her feet using a tree trunk for support, and her vision swam with black spots that threatened to pull her down into unconsciousness. Through the trees, she could see a small clearing where a human woman sat beside a fire turning a rabbit on a spit, while humming a tune that sounded familiar, but Lauren couldn't place where she had heard it before. The woman had dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, and wore practical traveling clothes that were stained with mud and tree sap. She didn't look like a soldier, but Lauren had learned that appearances could be deadly lies. "Touch me again, and I will suck all your blood, human." The words came out as a hiss before Lauren even realized she was speaking, and the woman looked up with surprised eyes that were brown and warm like honey in sunlight. Lauren's fangs extended automatically as the old defensive magic surged through her blood and made her stronger than she had been moments before. The human woman stood slowly with her hands raised to show she carried no weapons except a small knife on her belt. "My name is Kira Bennett, and I mean you no harm." Her voice was calm and steady, like someone used to dealing with frightened creatures. Lauren wanted to believe her, but trust was a luxury she could no longer afford, because the last time she trusted that humans wouldn't hurt her, people, an entire village, burned to ashes. Ember moved closer, and his massive body blocked Kira from getting any nearer to Lauren. The dragon's scales glowed with internal heat that meant he was ready to breathe fire if this human made one wrong move. Kira looked at Ember with respect rather than fear, and Lauren noticed that her hands didn't shake, even though she was standing 10 feet away from a dragon who could incinerate her in seconds. "You're hurt and alone, and you need food." Kira gestured to the cooking rabbit, and then slowly, very slowly, she took a step forward. Lauren hissed again, and Ash swooped down from above to land beside his brother, while Cloud circled overhead ready to attack on command. But Kira didn't stop moving forward, and when she was close enough to touch Lauren's face, she reached out with one gentle hand. Lauren slapped the hand away hard enough to leave a red mark on Kira's wrist, but the human woman didn't pull back or show anger. Instead, she touched Lauren's cheek again, and this time her fingers were soft and warm against skin that felt cold and clammy from fever. Lauren wanted to bite her, wanted to taste the blood that pulsed beneath that foolishly offered wrist, but something in Kira's eyes stopped her. It was the same look Lauren's mother used to have when she tended to wounded animals that wandered into the village. It was compassion mixed with determination, and it confused Lauren because she thought humans were incapable of caring about anyone who wasn't their own kind. "Why are you helping me?" Lauren's voice cracked and betrayed how weak she really was. Kira sat down in the dirt and pulled a canteen from her pack, then held it out like an offering to a wild creature she hoped to tame through patience. "Because those soldiers don't speak for all of us." Lauren snatched the canteen and drank deeply while the dragons watched every movement Kira made. The water was cool and clean and tasted better than anything Lauren had consumed in days. When she finished drinking, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and studied the human woman who had somehow found her in the endless forest. "How did you find me?" Kira smiled slightly and gestured to the sky where smoke from the burning village still rose in the distance like a dark pillar connecting earth to heaven. "I saw the smoke 2 days ago, and I came to see if anyone needed help." She paused and her smile faded into something sadder. "I used to live near an elf village before the wars started, and I learned your people aren't the monsters that soldiers claim you are." Lauren felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of this stranger. "Your people killed my family." The words came out flat and emotionless because if she let herself feel the full weight of that statement, she would collapse. Kira nodded and Lauren saw genuine pain flash across her face like she understood exactly what that kind of loss felt like. "I know, and I am sorry, and I cannot fix what they did, but I can help you now if you will let me." It should have been impossible to trust her, but Lauren was so tired of being alone and afraid. Cloud landed beside Kira and sniffed her outstretched hand before making a soft chirping sound that meant the youngest dragon sensed no danger from this human. If Cloud trusted her, then maybe Lauren could take a chance. Kira divided the cooked rabbit and gave half to Lauren, who ate slowly, because her stomach had shrunk from days without proper food. They sat together in silence while the dragons settled around them like guards standing watch over something precious and fragile. After eating, Lauren felt strong enough to speak without her voice shaking. "Where are we going?" Kira looked at her with those warm brown eyes that held secrets Lauren couldn't read. "There is a place where people like us go when they have nowhere else to turn." She paused and added quietly, "A place where humans and elves live together in peace." Lauren wanted to laugh because peace between their races seemed like a fairy tale told to children who didn't know better. But then she looked at Kira's face and saw that the human woman believed every word she was saying. Maybe fairy tales were just truths that hadn't happened yet. They traveled together for 5 days through the deep forest where ancient trees grew so tall that their tops disappeared into clouds, and the ground stayed covered in shadows. Even at noon, Kira walked while Lauren rode on Ember's back because her strength returned slowly like water filling a dried-up well, one drop at a time. The human woman knew the forest better than Lauren expected, and she led them along hidden paths that avoided the main roads where soldiers might patrol. At night they made small fires that produced little smoke, and Kira shared stories about her life before the wars, while Lauren listened and tried to understand how a human could speak about elves with such fondness. Kira had grown up in a border town where both races traded goods and shared festivals, and her best friend as a child had been an elf girl named Ivy, who taught her how to climb trees and speak the old language. When the wars started, Ivy's family fled in the night without saying goodbye, and Kira never saw her friend again. She spent years wondering if Ivy was alive or dead, and that wondering turned into a determination to help any elf she encountered, because maybe somewhere someone was helping Ivy. Too, Lauren found herself softening toward this strange human who carried her own grief like a stone in her pocket. On the 6th day, they reached a river that ran fast and deep with snowmelt from distant mountains, and Kira said they needed to follow it upstream for another 2 days before they would reach the hidden valley. The dragons didn't like the river because its roar made it hard to hear approaching danger, and Ember kept his wings half spread ready to take flight at the first sign of trouble. Lauren climbed down from his back and walked beside Kira along the rocky shore while Cloud played in the shallows, snapping at fish with his sharp teeth. This was the first time Lauren had walked instead of riding, and her legs felt weak, but she needed to rebuild her strength if she was going to survive whatever came next. Kira talked about the hidden valley as they walked and described gardens where food grew year-round, because elf magic combined with human engineering created perfect growing conditions. She spoke of workshops where craftspeople from both races worked together to create tools and art that neither could make alone. She painted a picture of a place that sounded too good to be true, but Lauren wanted to believe in it, because the alternative was spending the rest of her life running and hiding. As the sun began to set, they found a cave beside the river where they could shelter for the night, and the dragons arranged themselves at the entrance like living doors that no enemy could pass. Lauren sat beside the small fire Kira built, and watched flames dance across the cave walls in patterns that reminded her of the symbols her grandmother used to draw when teaching magic. "Do you know magic?" Lauren asked suddenly, and Kira looked up surprised by the question. "I know a little," Kira admitted. "Ivy taught me some basic spells before she left, but I never had the gift like your people do." Lauren felt the familiar tingle of power in her fingertips, and on impulse, she reached out and touched Kira's hand. She whispered words in the old language and watched as a soft blue light surrounded both their hands like they were holding a piece of captured sky. Kira gasped and stared at the light with wonder in her eyes. "What is this?" "It is a truth spell," Lauren explained. "It lets me see if someone is lying, and it lets you see what I truly feel." The blue light pulsed between them, and Lauren felt Kira's emotions flowing through the connection. She felt the human woman's genuine desire to help, and her deep sadness over lost friends and her determination to build something better than the world of hatred she had inherited. In return, Kira felt Lauren's pain and fear, and the tiny fragile hope that was beginning to grow despite everything telling her that hope was dangerous. When the spell faded, they sat in silence while the fire crackled and the dragon snored softly at the cave entrance. "I believe you," Lauren said quietly, "about the valley and about wanting to help." Kira smiled, and it transformed her whole face from serious to joyful in an instant. "Thank you for trusting me." Lauren nodded but didn't say that trust was still a difficult thing for her because some wounds took longer to heal than others. The next morning they continued following the river, upstream, and the terrain grew steeper and more difficult to navigate. Lauren's legs burned with effort, but she refused to ride Ember because she needed to prove to herself that she was strong enough to keep going. Kira noticed her struggling but didn't offer help because she seemed to understand that Lauren needed to do this on her own. Around midday, they heard voices ahead, and immediately the dragons went on alert with Ember, positioning himself in front of both women. While Ash and Cloud took to the air through the trees, Lauren could see 3 human soldiers standing beside the river, examining tracks in the mud. Her heart nearly stopped when she realized the tracks were hers and Kira's from earlier that morning. Kira grabbed Lauren's arm and pulled her behind a large boulder while signaling the dragons to stay quiet. The soldiers were young and looked bored as they poked at the tracks with sticks and argued about whether they belonged to travelers or refugees. One of them wanted to follow the trail, but the others said it was too close to the forbidden zone and that their captain would punish them if they went any further. Lauren held her breath and pressed against the cold stone while Ember's body vibrated with barely contained fury. If the dragons attacked, it would alert every soldier within miles and their journey would end before it truly began. Kira seemed to be thinking the same thing, and she placed a calming hand on Ember's scales while whispering soothing words in broken elf language. The soldiers finally decided to turn back and report that they found nothing but animal tracks. After they disappeared down the trail, Lauren released the breath she had been holding and her whole body shook with relief. "That was close," Kira whispered. "Too close," Lauren agreed. "We need to be more careful." They waited another hour before continuing, and this time they walked in the river itself, so their tracks would wash away in the current. The water was freezing and made Lauren's feet go numb, but it was better than being captured by soldiers who would show no mercy. As the sun set on the 7th day, Kira pointed to a narrow gap between 2 cliff faces that looked like nothing more than a shadow. "That is the entrance to the valley." Her voice carried excitement and relief. "We are almost home." Lauren looked at the dark passage and felt both fear and hope warring in her chest. She had come this far trusting a human stranger and 3 loyal dragons. Now she would see if that trust had been misplaced or if fairy tales could actually come true. The passage between the cliffs was so narrow that Ember had to fold his wings tight against his body to squeeze through, and the darkness pressed around them like a living thing with weight and substance. Lauren walked close behind Kira with one hand trailing along the cold stone wall while her other hand rested on the knife she had taken from her destroyed village. Behind her she could hear Ash and Cloud making nervous sounds that echoed strangely in the confined space. The passage twisted and turned for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and just when Lauren began to worry they were walking into a trap, The wall suddenly opened up. What lay beyond took her breath away completely. The valley spread before them like a painting come to life, with green fields and orchards and a crystal-clear lake that reflected the mountains rising on all sides. Small houses built from stone and wood dotted the landscape, and smoke rose from chimneys in thin white lines that meant people were cooking evening meals. But what shocked Lauren most was seeing humans and elves working together in the fields. Children of both races played near the lake, throwing stones and laughing in ways that made her chest ache with memories of her own childhood. Kira turned to look at Lauren's face and smiled at whatever expression she found there. Welcome to Haven. The settlement was larger than Lauren expected, with at least 200 people living in small clusters of houses that formed neighborhoods connected by dirt path as they walked down into the valley. People stopped their work to wave at Kira and stare curiously at Lauren and her dragons. Lauren felt exposed and vulnerable under all those watching eyes. But no one looked hostile or afraid. A tall elf woman with silver hair approached them, and her face broke into a huge smile when she saw Kira. You are back, and you brought someone. The woman's eyes moved to Lauren and softened with understanding. Another survivor. Kira nodded and placed a gentle hand on Lauren's shoulder. This is Lauren and her dragons, Ember, Ash, and Cloud. She gestured to the silver-haired woman, Lauren. This is Nina, who helps run. Haven. Nina studied Lauren with eyes that had seen too much pain and somehow survived it anyway. You are safe here, child. Her voice carried the weight of absolute truth. No soldiers can find this place, and everyone who lives here has chosen peace over war. Lauren wanted to believe her, but 300 years of life had taught her that safety was usually an illusion that shattered at the worst possible moment. Nina seemed to read her doubt, and instead of arguing, she simply said, Come, and I will show you where you can rest. She led them to a small house at the edge of the settlement near the lake, where the dragons would have space to fly and hunt. The house had 2 rooms with simple furniture and windows that looked out over water that sparkled in the fading sunlight. Nina left them with promises of food and fresh clothes, and when she closed the door behind her, Lauren finally allowed herself to collapse onto the bed. Kira sat in a chair by the window and looked out at the valley with an expression that might have been relief or exhaustion, or both. Thank you, Lauren said quietly, for bringing me here. Kira turned, and her tired face brightened with a small smile. Thank you for trusting me enough to come. That night, the people of Haven gathered for a communal dinner in a large building at the center of the settlement, and Kira insisted that Lauren join them. Lauren wanted to hide in the small house with her dragons, but she knew she needed to meet the others if she was going to live here. The dining hall was warm and loud with conversation and laughter, and long tables were covered with more food than Lauren had seen since before the attack. She sat beside Kira and tried not to stare at how naturally humans and elves interacted, like the wars that raged outside this valley didn't exist. An elderly human man sat across from them and introduced himself as Henry, who had been one of the founders of Haven 20 years ago. He had lost his wife and son to elf warriors, and yet he spoke without bitterness about building this place where future generations wouldn't have to lose anyone. Next to Henry sat a young elf man named Lucas, who had lost his entire clan to human soldiers, and yet he worked every day in the fields alongside the same race that had destroyed his family. Lauren listened to their stories and slowly began to understand that everyone here carried scars, but they chose to build something new instead of nursing old wounds forever. After dinner, Kira walked Lauren back to the small house while the dragons flew overhead, enjoying their freedom after days of cautious travel. The lake reflected moonlight like scattered diamonds, and the air smelled clean and free from smoke or blood or fear. Lauren stopped walking and turned to face Kira, who looked at her with those warm brown eyes that had convinced her to take a chance on hope. Why did you really help me? Kira was quiet for a moment before answering. Because I was tired of watching good people die, for bad reasons, and because someone needed to be the first to reach across the divide. She paused and added softly, and because you reminded me of Ivy, and I hoped that maybe somewhere someone was helping her too. Lauren felt tears burning behind her eyes, but this time she didn't fight them. They spilled down her cheeks while Kira pulled her into a hug that felt like the first safe thing Lauren had experienced since her world ended. They stood like that beside the moonlit lake while the dragons circled overhead, and somewhere in the distance, children laughed, and the sound carried on the wind like a promise. Over the next few weeks, Lauren slowly adapted to life in Haven and learned that peace required as much courage as war, but in different ways. She helped in the gardens and discovered she enjoyed making things grow. She attended council meetings where humans and elves worked together to solve problems through discussion instead of violence. She taught some of the children how to communicate with small wild dragons that lived in the mountains and watched their faces light up with wonder. The nightmares about the attack came less frequently, and when they did come, Kira was always there to sit with her until the fear passed. Lauren realized she was building a new life from the ashes of her old one, and that maybe her grandmother had been right about tragedy leading to something beautiful, if you were brave enough to keep walking forward one evening. She found Kira sitting by the lake watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that had no names. Lauren sat beside her and they stayed quiet for a while, just existing together in comfortable silence. "I never thanked you properly," Lauren said finally, "for saving my life." Kira shook her head and smiled. "You saved yourself by choosing to trust, when trust seemed impossible." She reached out and touched Lauren's hand the same way she had that first day in the forest. "We saved each other." Lauren squeezed her hand and looked out at the valley that had become her home. She thought about her family and her destroyed village and all the pain that had led her here. She thought about the humans who had killed her people and the human who had given her a reason to hope again. Life was complicated and painful and beautiful all at once, and maybe that was the point. Maybe the real victory was not in destroying your enemies, but in transforming them into friends. Maybe peace was just another word for courage. 3 months passed in Haven, and Lauren discovered that healing took longer than breaking but was worth every difficult moment. She woke each morning to the sound of children playing outside her window and the sight of ember ash and cloud sleeping peacefully in the grass beside the lake. The dragons had grown comfortable in this place where no one feared them or tried to cage them, and they spent their days teaching young dragons from the mountains how to fish and fly in formation. Lauren worked in the gardens most mornings alongside an elderly elf woman named Ruth, who had survived 4 different attacks before finding Haven, and still believed that every seed planted was an act of defiance against those who wanted only destruction. Ruth taught Lauren patience and showed her that growth happened slowly in ways that weren't always visible, until suddenly you looked around and realized everything had changed. In the afternoons, Lauren helped Kira in the workshop where they repaired tools and built furniture for new arrivals who came to Haven with nothing but trauma and hope. They worked side by side without much talking, because they had reached that comfortable place where silence felt like its own kind of conversation. Sometimes, their hands would brush while reaching for the same hammer or piece of wood, and Lauren no longer flinched at the contact. Sometimes Kira would hum the old elf songs that Lauren had taught her, and hearing those melodies in a human voice made something warm bloom in Lauren's chest. The nightmares still came, but less frequently now, and when they did, Kira would appear at her door with hot tea and sit quietly until the shaking stopped. Lauren never asked how Kira always knew when the bad dreams came, and Kira never explained. Some things didn't need words. One morning, Nina called everyone to the central hall for an important meeting, and Lauren felt her old defensive instincts flare up because important meetings usually meant bad news. The hall, filled with every resident of Haven, from the youngest children to the oldest survivors, and the air buzzed with nervous energy. Nina stood at the front with Henry beside her, and she waited until everyone was quiet before speaking. "We have received word that a group of soldiers is planning to search this area." Her voice stayed calm, but Lauren saw worry in her eyes. "They do not know Haven exists, but they will be close enough that we need to take precautions." Fear rippled through the crowd like wind across water, and Lauren felt her heart start to race beside her. Kira reached over and took her hand, and the touch anchored Lauren before panic could fully take hold. Henry stepped forward and raised his hands for attention. "We have survived for 20 years by being careful and smart, and we will survive this too." He outlined a plan to post lookouts in the mountain passes and to hide any signs of the settlement that might be visible from a distance. Everyone would need to be extra vigilant about smoke from fires and noise that carried, and any tracks that led toward the valley entrance. Lauren volunteered to fly patrols with her dragons, because they could cover more ground than any land-based scout and see threats coming from miles away. Nina accepted gratefully and assigned her shifts alongside Lucas and 2 other elves who also had bonded dragons. For the next week, Lauren spent her days flying high above the valley, while Ember's sharp eyes scanned the forest below for any sign of soldiers. At night she would return exhausted and fall into bed while Kira brought her food and rubbed the tension from her shoulders. On the 8th day of patrol, Lauren spotted movement at the edge of the forest where the main road came, closest to the hidden entrance. She signaled Ember to drop lower and saw 12 soldiers making camp for the night, less than 2 miles from the valley. Her blood turned cold and she immediately flew back to warn the others. Nina called an emergency council meeting and everyone agreed that the soldiers were too close for comfort. Henry suggested they send someone to lead the soldiers away from the area, but that plan was risky because whoever went might get captured. Lauren stood up before she could talk herself out of it. "I will go." The room erupted in arguments, but Lauren kept her voice steady. "I can fly fast enough to stay ahead of them and lead them in circles until they give up." Kira grabbed her arm with fear written all over her face. "That is too dangerous." Lauren looked at her and smiled sadly. "This is my home now and these are my people, and I will not let soldiers destroy another place I love." The council debated for another hour, but eventually agreed that Lauren's plan was their best option. She would leave at dawn and create a trail that the soldiers would follow away from. Nina pulled her aside after the meeting ended and placed both hands on Lauren's shoulders. "Come back to us." It wasn't a request, but a command. Lauren nodded. Because she had every intention of surviving this, she had found something worth living for and she wasn't ready to let it go. That night, Kira came to her house and they sat together on the porch while the dragons slept nearby. Lauren could feel the fear radiating from Kira like heat from a fire. "I will come back," she promised. "You saved my life and gave me a home and I will not throw that away." Kira looked at her with tears streaming down her face. "You became so much more than someone I saved." Her voice broke. "You became the reason I believe we can actually win this war by building something better." Lauren pulled her close and held her while they both cried. She realized in that moment that somewhere along the way this human woman had become the most important person in her life. Before dawn, Lauren climbed onto Ember's back while Kira and half the settlement gathered to see her off. She flew toward the soldiers' camp and made sure they saw her circling overhead. The soldiers immediately broke camp and started following her trail just as she had planned. For 2 days, Lauren led them on a winding path through the forest, always staying just far enough ahead that they thought they could catch her. She doubled back and created false trails and generally made their pursuit as difficult and confusing as possible. On the 3rd day, the soldiers finally gave up and turned back toward their main base. Exhausted and frustrated, Lauren waited until they were completely gone before flying back to Haven. When she landed beside the lake, the entire settlement was waiting, and Kira ran to her and hugged her so hard that Lauren could barely breathe. "You did it," Nina said with pride in her voice. "You saved us all." Lauren looked around at the faces of humans and elves standing together and realized that this was what winning looked like. Not destroying your enemies, but protecting the people you loved. That night, Haven celebrated with music and food and dancing under the stars. Lauren sat beside Kira and watched children play while the dragons performed aerial tricks that made everyone cheer. Kira leaned close and whispered, "Thank you for coming back." Lauren smiled and touched her face the same way Kira had touched hers all those months ago, in the burning forest. "Thank you for giving me something worth coming back to." She thought about the long journey from despair to hope and realized that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about choosing to build a future anyway. She had lost her family and her home and everything she thought defined her, but she had gained new family and new home and discovered that she was stronger than she ever imagined. The war still raged outside the valley, but inside Haven, peace grew one day at a time, and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything.